Ukraine is to be supplied with cluster bombs by the US. That's despite a ban by many countries and most NATO members. The United Nations says such weapons are against humanitarian law because they're indiscriminate. So, what's behind the US decision? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. War is a dirty business, but the decision by the US to supply cluster bombs to Ukraine has crossed a line that many of its NATO allies wouldn't. The UN says the weapons breach international humanitarian law. The US says it has no option but to send them to Ukraine because it's running out of conventional munitions. Both accuse Russia of using cluster bombs in the war. So why is the US doing this now? We'll be discussing it with our guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Laura Khan.
These cluster bombs are considered so dangerous, they've been banned by more than 120 countries. But the US says they'll be included in a new military aid package to Ukraine. Neither have joined the convention banning their use, nor has Russia.
Mr. President, cluster munitions, why now?
We've run out of ammunition.
So just how dangerous are they? The missile canisters contain hundreds of smaller bombs that spread out in the air. This means they are indiscriminate and can have a widespread and devastating impact. The International Committee of the Red Cross says as many as 40% of the bomblets fail to detonate and can pose a threat to civilians decades later. Human Rights Watch accuses Ukraine and Russia of killing civilians with cluster weapons.
The problem with cluster munitions is dud rate, because these munitions drop large numbers of what are bomblets. Depending on how they land, some of them don't go off.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak didn't directly criticise President Joe Biden, but did say that Britain does not support the use of the weapons in general.
The UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use.
But the UK has itself been criticised for sending other weapons that can cause lasting environmental damage and serious illness for people long after the wars have ended. In March, it confirmed it would provide armour-piercing rounds that contain depleted uranium. First used by the US in Iraq in the first Gulf War 32 years ago, they've left a legacy of cancers and illnesses among people there and in other countries bombed by NATO. The international nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, says there could be a risk to people who handle fragments of depleted uranium. And a 2019 study in the journal Environmental Pollution linked the use of shells in the war in Iraq to a sharp rise in birth defects and cancer. The US says it must send cluster bombs now because Ukraine is running out of conventional weapons. But even some House representatives in Biden's Democratic Party have criticised the decision, saying the weapons will kill civilians and leave the US unable to occupy the high moral ground in the war by adopting tactics it previously accused Russia of using. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's take a look at the legacy left by cluster bombs. The United Nations says that in the last year it finalised a count, 2021, it recorded at least 360 casualties globally. Much higher figures are expected when the war in Ukraine is included. In the first 6 months of the conflict, 215 civilians were killed and 474 injured by cluster weapons. The cluster munition monitor used by the UN shows that most victims of cluster bombs are civilians. In 2020, it says they made up all casualties of such weapons worldwide. That year, nearly half of all casualties were children, where the age was known, at a quarter were women and girls. Among the victims were people in countries where wars ended some years ago, such as Cambodia, Laos and Iraq. Let's bring in our guests then for today's discussion. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by William B. Taylor, Executive Vice President at the U.S. Institute of Peace and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. From Moscow, Dmitry Babich, Editor at InoSMI, Internet Media Project, and also joining us from Washington, D.C., Sarah Yager, Washington Director at Human Rights Watch. A warm welcome to you all. William, let's start with you first. You are in favor of the transfer of these weapons to Ukraine, as I understand it. Why is that?
So, Adrian, I'm in favor of the Ukrainians being victorious over the Russians, that the Russians have invaded their country. I'm in favor of the Ukrainians having the ability to stop the Russian invasion. I'm in favor of the United States supporting Ukraine in its attempt to stop the Russian invasion. And the rest of NATO is joining in that effort. So I'm in favor of the Ukrainian victory. It turns out, as you've just reported, that the way that the Ukrainians can move to victory goes through artillery. They need artillery. And it turns out, again, as you've reported, that the artillery rounds, the stocks, both in Ukraine and in the United States, are running out. That they are running out, we are running out, the Ukrainians are running out of the unitary artillery weapons, ammunition. That is the non-cluster bomb. So the only thing that we have left to provide the Ukrainians to stop the Russian invasion and to push the Russians out of the country, out of Ukraine, are these cluster bombs. No one likes this. No one is comfortable with this decision. But if the decision is to allow the Russians to overrun Ukraine, which they have said they want to do. This is what the Russians are after, is to destroy Ukraine, wipe it off the map, Adrian. This is what they've said. If that's the choice, then we have to provide these weapons.
I just want to play you, William, a clip of White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki speaking in the early days of the war about cluster munitions. Here's what she said.
There are reports of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime.
William, if the potential use of cluster munitions in Ukraine is by Russia is a war crime, the insinuation here is that rules apply to others and not to the US and its allies.
The rules apply to everyone, Adrian. You're no doubt about that. All the rules apply to us, the Ukrainians, to the Russians, and everyone. There's no doubt about that. The question is how to stop this illegal, immoral invasion by the Russians of Ukraine. And if the only choice is to use these weapons that have been banned by some countries but not others, if that's the only choice, then I think we have that's a moral choice. It's a moral choice to support the Ukrainians in their defense against the Russian aggression.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, what do you make of what you've heard so far?
Well, let's get the facts straight first. There was a Human Rights Watch report, I think back in the early 2015, maybe even in late 2014, that the Ukrainian troops used cluster weapons. And it was very well documented and confirmed. There were Human Rights Watch people on the ground who interviewed the victims, who showed the places where cluster bombs were used. Probably there were later reports of the use of cluster weapons by Russia, but first I didn't see them. I mean, I didn't see them in international news reports. There was, if they were, there were a lot was documented. And also, let me remind you that in 2014, 2015, these were not Russian troops who participated in the war that started then and not in 2022. But these were the local insurgents, the so-called pro-Russian separatists, as the Kiev government called them. Let me again remind you that the government in Kiev came to power thanks to a violent coup in February 2014. So Ukraine, as far as I remember, denied using cluster weapons, and Russia denied using cluster weapons. So we have this situation here when Ukraine definitely used cluster weapons, Russia probably, and now the United States wants Ukraine to use cluster weapons on massive scale. That's terrible. I don't want to whitewash the Russian government. There is a big discussion going on in Russia whether it was worth it, to get involved in an all-out war in order to stop the bombing and the shelling of Donbass, which continued for 8 years.
Okay.
But certainly, this is not a way to stop the violence by sending these kind of prohibited weapons. It's like, again,
Dmitry,
I'm against using the term equalizing the chances, because how can you equalize the chances of two sides? Maybe by using chemical weapons,
I was going to ask you, Dmitry. Dmitry, I was going to ask you, does this cross, if Ukraine uses these weapons supplied by the US, does it cross a red line for Russia? Would it then, do you think, be justified in responding in kind? Does it give Russia to use does it give Russia an excuse to use weapons that are other kinds of weapons that are banned for humanitarian reasons?
Well, you said it, and even though no one in the Russian government said so far anything on that subject, I think that will be a logical consequence. I don't think the result will be the Ukrainian army pushing the Russians out of their land. Let me remind you that millions of people liaised their destinies, their lives with Russia in the last 8 years, in Crimea, in Donetsk, in Lugansk. These are Russian people speaking Russian, and they will not become Ukrainian in future. So if the Ukrainian government returns to control over these territories, there's going to be a huge human tragedy. What is going on now is also a human tragedy. But Russia will not give up those territories. If Ukrainians use cluster weapons, Russia may also use some very destructive weapons, not necessarily nuclear ones, but some very destructive weapons in order to protect the people whom Russia considers its citizens. The people living in Donetsk now, the people living even in Kherson or next to Crimea, they are considered Russian citizens by our law. So everything will be used to protect them from cluster weapons.
Okay, Sarah, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I'll be with you in just a moment because I know you've got lots to say, but I just want to give William the right to reply there. William, where is the threat to the people of Ukraine from Russia? It's not as life-threatening, is it, as the use of cluster munitions?
Adrian, the threat to the people of Ukraine from Russia is existential, literally. The Russian government, President Putin has said that there's no such thing as Ukraine. He wants to wipe Ukraine off the map. So yes, there is a direct threat to Ukraine, Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian civilians. We agree about the need to protect civilians. Everyone agrees about the need to protect civilians. It's Ukrainian civilians that have been killed by Russian indiscriminate attacks, not just by cluster bombs. So yes, there is an existential threat to Ukraine from Russia in this invasion, and it's recognized by the world.
Sarah Yager, what's Human Rights Watch's position on this?
Sure. Thanks for having me. And let me just say, I deeply respect Ambassador Taylor, and I agree with most of the things that he has said today, except that cluster munitions are going to make the difference in this conflict. That has not been proven. It is very hard to see exactly the military utility because the Pentagon has not shared its data either on dud rates or the effectiveness of these weapons against the Russian threat. And there are two big problems that I see. One is humanitarian. There is no way to make these weapons harmless. Absolutely no way. And we have already documented Ukrainians using cluster munitions. We just put out our findings earlier this week that Ukrainian civilians have already been killed by Ukrainians using cluster munitions. Again, there's no way to make these harmless. And second, there is a global norm being broken here. The majority of the globe's nations have banned these weapons specifically because they are too dangerous for the battlefield. I am worried both about what is going to happen in Ukraine and what is going to happen on this slippery slope for conflicts in the future.
Sarah, are there any circumstances that would justify the use of cluster munitions in your view?
I don't believe so. They are inherently indiscriminate. And this argument that Russia is using cluster munitions with a very high dud rate, the argument that Ukraine should use cluster munitions as well is a race to the bottom. And I'm very concerned about that, including for Ukrainian civilians.
They continue to kill and pollute, often years after they've been deployed, regardless of which side prevails in this conflict. Someone is going to have to deal with the long-term human and environmental impact, or leave large tracts of land unusable. I mean, who's that going to be? Who is responsible for clearing up?
The United States is the largest donor to demining efforts around the world. And because it used cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines in various places around the world, is giving a lot of money already because of the unexploded ordnance, these duds that are all over Ukraine. It is $73 billion to clean them up. That is without the U.S. cluster munitions being sent. So this is going to be a massive, expensive cleanup effort. And President Biden is going to have to address this when he goes to Vienna and talks with the European nations about reconstruction, rebuilding, and the money that it's going to take to clean these up.
Ambassador Taylor, I know you want to come in there. The US dropped an estimated 260 million cluster munitions in Laos between 1964 and 1973. So far, fewer than 400,000, or 0.47%, have been cleared, and at least 11,000 people have been killed, according to Reuters. These weapons pose a far greater threat to civilians than they do their intended military targets, don't they? There's a reason why so many nations refuse to use them.
Adrian, again, no one wants to use these weapons. Everyone would like to have the regular, the unitary weapons, the unitary ammunition for the artillery. There's no doubt. I don't dispute anything that Sarah just said or that you just said. And you asked about the cleanup. Yes, there will have to be cleanup. Yes, the unexploded ordnance will have to be cleaned up. It turns out, Adrian, as you well know, that the mining that the Russians have done is extensive up and down the line. The estimates are 10 million mines, not anti-personnel mines, some anti-personnel mines, but mostly anti-tank mines. They're about 10 million up and down the lines in Ukraine that the Russians have planted. They'll all have to be dug up. They'll all have to be defused. And you're exactly right. The United States is preparing to and has already provided the demining capabilities. We will provide more, I am sure. The Ukrainians are working on demining capabilities. They're going to have to be cleaned up. All of those 10 million anti-tank mines up and down the line are going to have to be, and at the same time that they are cleaning up the anti-tank mines and diffusing them, they will be cleaning up the cluster munitions that are the duds that are still there. By the way, the dud rate of the Russian mine, the Russian cluster munitions, is in the 30 to 40% range, whereas the dud rate, according to the Defense Department, is 1 to 3%. So they'll still have to be cleaned up. No one likes these weapons. No one likes this ammunition. It'd be better if we didn't have to use them. But if the choice is allowing the Russians to run over Ukraine and take it over, that's the danger to civilians. That's a danger to Ukrainian civilians, Adrian.
Dmitry, Russia says the transfer of these cluster munitions to Ukraine smacks of desperation. What does it tell us about the conflict itself? The fact that, as we heard from Ambassador Taylor there, Ukraine is running out of conventional military weaponry, ammunition, and which side, if either, is able to gain some sort of advantage militarily?
Well, I think the best solution here would be a compromise. Unfortunately, it's the United States and the European Union who do not want to compromise in Ukraine. They have shipwrecked the negotiations that were going on in Istanbul last year in March, and we were very close to a compromise with Ukraine. It did not presuppose Russia running over Ukraine or wiping Ukraine off the map. Certainly, Putin never said it. Putin said that he wanted to make Ukraine secure for Russia. He wanted Ukraine to be demilitarized and denazified. This is the exact quote. He didn't want to destroy Ukraine as a country. He probably means that he wants to destroy the Ukrainian regime, even though he didn't go as far as saying that. As for the future, as for the perspectives, let me tell you that, of course, it's a sign of desperation, because the United States Congress prohibited sending U.S. made cluster weapons to other countries. There was no waiver of this prohibition by the Congress. So if we believe the Washington Post, for example, President Biden is in fact somehow maybe even making an extensive use of his presidential powers. To me, this shows that the United States has become an ideological state, just like the Nazi and the communist ideological states in the past. We know that in totalitarian states, ideology goes before the law. The main thing for the ultra-liberal ideology, which is now reigns in the United States and the European Union, is to have Ukraine as a victor. They don't care about the losses. They don't care about the Ukrainian people. They want Ukraine to win, as they say. So that's why they're ready to bend the rules, to, breach the laws, to send the most destructive weapons. They just want to see their side win. As for Russia, of course, we're very, very unhappy about this. We're very unhappy about the need to put landmines. Certainly, President Putin didn't plan it when he started the so-called military operation in February last year, because sooner or later we will have to clean it up. Because there are, after all, mostly Russian people living in eastern Ukraine. And if you read the United States press, it recognized this back in the 90s, back in the 2000s. Only now they keep saying that Ukraine is such a separate country, totally different from Russia. It has a completely different identity. No, we have a joint identity in many ways, and we will have to clean it up ourselves in future. That's very unfortunate because, as you rightly said, cluster weapons are very dangerous. They keep exploding. They keep killing people years after they have been used or misused, whatever you call it. So Sarah, I think it's absolutely imperative to listen to the Human Rights Watch on this occasion and not to send cluster weapons to Ukraine and to prohibit both Russia and Ukraine any use of cluster weapons in this war.
I want to bring in Sarah from Human Rights Watch once again. As we said at the beginning of the programme, war is a dirty business, Sarah. And as we heard in our report, depleted uranium used by the US in Iraq in the first Gulf War 32 years ago has left a legacy of cancers and illnesses among people there and in other countries bombed by NATO. Ukraine's also been using British-supplied weapons that contain depleted uranium. Is Human Rights Watch concerned that the people of the border region in Ukraine and Russia will suffer in the same way as people in Iraq have done?
We don't have any research on depleted uranium at the moment, so we can get into that a little bit later. Let me just make two quick comments about what's been said. First, President Biden actually made this decision and signed a waiver completely within the rule of law within the United States. It's a shame that he did because Congress thought that these weapons were far too dangerous to send anywhere and made a prohibition against transferring them to any weapon. President Biden, within the law, signed a waiver, and it basically just says, we're going to prohibit these except when we really need them. And I think that that's really unfortunate. I also just want to go to this dud rate because everyone is talking about what the Pentagon has reported about the dud rate. We actually have, Human Rights Watch has done a bunch of research and has Pentagon reports going back to the 2000s that actually have a 14% dud rate on these very weapons. Now, perhaps there are variants that the Pentagon is looking at, but they have not provided any data. So within our democracy, there is no transparency about where these numbers are coming from. And so to repeat them, that there is a 1.5% dud rate, a 2.35, we're hearing these variations. Every answer is different. Where were they tested? On what kind of ground? In what kind of circumstances? We're not getting any of those answers. And I think that that is a real problem in this case.
Okay. Ambassador Taylor, William, I just want a very quick thought from you. If you want to, given that you fought in Iraq about this use of depleted uranium, and then most members of NATO have signed up to this international ban on cluster munitions. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that the alliance didn't have a formal position on their use on the battlefield and that the decision on their use would be down to individual countries. I mean, what are we to make of that? That there's no unity among an alliance on the use of weapons that many members find abhorrent and have pledged not to use?
The Secretary General is exactly right. NATO as an organization doesn't decide on weapons. Individual countries, individual members do. We've not heard any condemnation from NATO members of this decision. Why? Because they recognize it's a hard decision. They recognize that they don't like these weapons. We don't like these weapons. The Congress doesn't like these weapons. The Defense Department doesn't like these weapons. But they all recognize that the alternative, that is no artillery rounds for the Ukrainians, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable morally, militarily, politically. It makes no sense to have the Ukrainians run out of weapons and not be able to defend themselves against the Russians that are invading their country. So the NATO members, they don't like it. We don't like it. However, they recognize, and they by their statements, they recognize that it's an individual decision by the Americans. Sarah's exactly right. The president used the waiver that's in the law. He doesn't like it. President Biden said he doesn't like this decision. But again, if the alternative is to let the Russians overrun the Ukrainians, he's not going to let that happen.
Okay, and William, we've got about a minute left. Is there anything you want to say about the use of depleted uranium? I know we're talking about cluster munitions, but the use of depleted uranium in that region of the world right now.
I have nothing to add to what Sarah said.
Okay, all right. Dmitry, we'll leave the last word to you then. Bear in mind, I've got about a minute left on the programme, so I need you to give me a fairly concise answer on what you've heard from our Washington guests in the last few moments.
Well, I would just say that, look, our opponents, they are planning to use cluster weapons. They are planning to use depleted uranium. How come they're for peace? How come they're defending democracy by such means? The same goes about the Ukrainian government. If they destroy monuments, if they cancel holidays, if they destroy religion, maybe they are the occupiers. Maybe they occupy this country where they change all the traditions, all the rules. Maybe not us, but they are the attackers.
And there, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it, as always, on Inside Story, even though I'd love to give the right of reply to William and Sarah in Washington. I'm afraid time is against us. The news waits for no one, and that's next. Thank you all for being with us. William Taylor, Dmitry Babich, and Sarah Yager. And thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this issue, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, the conversation continues on Twitter. Our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you again. Bye for now.